It's 17.
I'm hanging on at number 15.
Wait, and we are live. We are live. Hi, I'm Caroline Leavitt. I'm the co-founder of A Mighty Blaze. And today is especially extraordinary because not only do I have a friend here who I absolutely love her work, but she is a phenomenal writer. And her book, The EXILES, just hit it's number 17 on the New York Times bestseller list.
15.
That is incredible, absolutely incredible, and it's zooming right up. So, Christina Baker Kline, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.
I'm so happy to be here, Carolyn. You know you're one of my favorite people of all time, so I'm just delighted.
So, I have an introduction for you. I'm going to give the official one, and then I'm going to give my one. The official one is that Christina Baker Kline, of course, is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 8 novels, including The EXILES, Orphan Train, and A Piece of the World. She's published in 40 countries. She's received the New England Prize for Fiction, the Maine Literary Award, and the Barnes & Noble Discover Award, among other prizes. She's been chosen by hundreds of communities as the One Book, One Read section. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the New York Times Book Review, the Boston Globe, the San Francisco Chronicle, LitHub, Psychology Today, and Slate. So I also want to say that I knew you, Christina, before you became so mega famous. I can remember we went and we had a lunch in Manhattan, and at that lunch, that was where you were telling me you were promoting one book and you had started this book about an orphan train. And it was the most lovely lunch, and I remember walking away saying, wow, I really like this woman. She's really great, and I bet that book's going to be big. And of course, it was like,
well, I want to tell my version of that lunch.
Okay.
So first of all, Caroline Leavitt was this first of all, she was, famous writer. And second, she was well known in writing circles for being an incredibly kind and generous person, even to writers who were emerging who didn't know her personally. And so I think I reached out to you shamelessly using some mutual friend's name and said, could I please take you to lunch? The phrase that I hate that people use is pick your brain. So I hope I did not use that phrase because it always feels too graphic to me. But I'm sure I did do that. And you so kindly had lunch with me. First of all, I couldn't believe you accepted. And I lived in Montclair, New Jersey. You lived in Hoboken, and we met for lunch in New York City. And you were unruffled by the fact that I had a million questions. And also your advice was so incredible. And Carolyn, I have used you as a model with many other people. And when people reach out to me, sometimes I'm too busy, but when I can, I do what you did. I pay it forward because it changed my life to talk to you. It really did.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, so, that's why it's especially wonderful to be here.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit more before we talk about The EXILES, which is absolutely an astonishingly great and brilliant book. I want to talk about that book that changed everything, because I read a lot of stuff. I read in an interview you gave where your then editor told you, okay, your next book, you have to write bigger. And then she said something which I found distressing, which was you have to write more like a man.
Oh, yeah.
What did that mean? And how did you feel about that? And did you know when you were writing Orphan Train that it was going to be this huge phenomenon? It was #1 on the New York Times for like 2 years or something. Nobody got it.
It was #1 for 5 weeks. It was on the list for 2 years. It was in the top 5 for a year. I mean, now when I think about it, I can't even believe it. It was like,
it's incredible. It's so great.
When I was in it, I spent a lot, we'll talk about this later maybe, but when I spent a lot of time feeling excruciatingly embarrassed and exposed. Like I have so many friends who are in the same boat I am, who are writers, who are every book, there's an up and down quality to publishing, Carolyn, as you know, and I just felt like, why did this happen to me? I didn't deserve this. And now my old self would now tell my younger self, just enjoy it better, enjoy it more, because it doesn't always happen. And it's a real crazy thing when it does. And you just need to say, this wonderful, crazy thing is happening and I have to enjoy it. But stepping back, I had no idea. Nobody had any idea that it would take off the way it did. But I will say I had changed everything about the way I approached fiction. And it was based on this advice. Yeah. So I have an amazing editor now, and she's been with me since before Orphan Train. But before that, I was with an editor who was a big she was a kind of a parody of a terrifying New York editor.
Oh, no.
And she was really, she actually recently got fired, but she was around for a long time. And she was notorious for being really rough, tough person, and not author friendly. I think she really actually did damage to my self-esteem. And I don't even know if she read my work. I mean, it was that kind of thing. But I had a book that didn't do as well as they had hoped. And this was before you could tell on Amazon and you could tell on social media. You know how now you sort of have a sense pretty early.
You have an idea.
What's going on. And back then they didn't have those markers. So the author was in the dark. And the only way you could tell is that you didn't get called from the publisher. You know, people stopped really calling you. And there was this echo chamber feeling of like, is everything okay? I don't know. It's really hard. So this was, for those of you who are just tuning in, this was a low moment in my publishing life, which has been for a long time. I had the sense that a book hadn't done well, but no one had said that to me. It was just out. It was only out for like 3 or 4 weeks, but I had a sense. So I screwed up my courage. She wouldn't return my phone calls. This editor was. So I went, you know what it's like, Carolyn. I had young kids. I was living in the suburbs. I had to plan a whole day to come into New York City. And I went to HarperCollins kind of unannounced.
Oh my God, that's
I know. And it was that kind of scene out of a movie where the editorial assistant is like, she's in a meeting. And I'm like, I don't care. I'm going in. And I went into her office and I stood in front of her desk. She was not in a meeting. And I said, all right, I sort of steeled up my courage. And I said, listen, I can tell that that people are disappointed. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. Like, I can tell that you're disappointed, but what can I do to, what am I doing wrong? I said that. And I didn't even want to hear it. I didn't even want to know, but I was so bereft. I was so upset that I was in this kind of, as I said, echo chamber. And she, without missing a beat or even saying, oh, no, the book is doing, whatever. She said 2 things. You're doing 2 things wrong. She's like, she said,
whoa, okay.
Yeah. She said, first of all, you're not writing with enough emotion. Your prose style in this novel is a little bit bloodless. You need to be emotionally, people want to feel what your main character is feeling. Okay. And you need to get closer emotionally, and then she said, your books need to have more heart. Okay. When I went to Yale, I went to Cambridge, I went to an MFA program where the whole point was to have this kind of New Yorker style distance, right? A little bit of coldness. I know we're not here to talk about this, but I'm just going to finish this quickly. And I think she was right, that I was afraid of sentimentality. So I wasn't quite jumping into the emotional underpinnings of my characters. And then the second thing, as you said, was she said, you need to write like a man. You need to be ambitious. You need to have a broader canvas. You need to write about things that scare you. You need to take more chances. You need to get out of the domestic sphere.
Why didn't she tell you this before?
Yeah, I know. Why didn't she? But I will say, after I recovered from the profound shock of her basically saying that my novel was a failure and that I was a terrible writer, after that, I sort of sifted through it and I thought about it, and it had a huge effect on the way I wrote Orphan Train. So that's that story.
Yeah, I think her advice is actually really good advice. But as I said, I would have wished that she would have told you much sooner. And also, did she tell you how to do that?
No, she did not tell me.
That's so unhelpful.
But it was helpful. Weirdly, it was helpful. I actually took it, as I said, I took it in. And when I stumbled on this story of the orphan trains, it was, we were visiting my husband's in-law, his mother for the holidays. And I had my little kids running around, and they pulled this book off the shelf with her. And it was a book filled with newspaper articles from her hometown, Jamestown, North Dakota. And we stumbled across this article about the orphan trains, and her father was featured in the article, and she had never even heard of the orphan trains. So I immediately knew this was a big story that no one knew about. 250,000 children sent on trains, ending in 1929, in a labor program where they were indentured to farmers, and they had there were no controls on this program at all. It wasn't like foster care today. It was like you just went to whoever picked you off the stage.
That's so horrible.
But I knew it was a big story. And as I began thinking about this editor's words, I realized I needed to tell it, even though I felt terrified by it.
That's incredible. That's an incredible story. So let's talk about the Exiles now, because talk about ambitious and complex. And I don't want to say writing like a man. I don't like that. I'm going to say writing like a woman. Like really powerful, astonishing book. And again, it's another story of convict women who were sent to Australia that I never heard of. And I remember you told me about that at yet another lunch we had, or maybe it was lunch fest. But tell us the story, because that is incredible. How did you come across it? Why did it haunt you into thinking, okay, this is what I want to write? And was there ever a moment where you felt, this is too big, I'm too afraid, I can't do it?
I always feel that way. I mean, honestly, that's the latest. That is a really big takeaway, I hope, for other people, certainly me from the orphan train experience, which is I am only interested in writing about things that terrify me.
Yeah.
Life is too short to write about things that make you feel warm and fuzzy and are sort of comfortable. Right. I've learned that, at least for me, and I will go back to writing contemporary novels someday too, and I hope to pull this knowledge with me. But I have learned I have to write scary, scary things. I was terrified of Orphan Train, as I've told you, for a host of reasons. My next novel, A Piece of the World, was even worse because everyone in that novel lived, and a lot of them are still alive. And furthermore, the Wyeth Foundation is quite litigious, and it's terrifying. Andrew Wyeth is the subject of that book, and Christina Olsen, whom he painted. She's his masterpiece of Christina's World, hangs at the Museum of Modern Art, and it's her story. But that was so scary because I was writing about a world that was very contained. And furthermore, in that novel, nothing happens. This woman is in her home. She lives in there. She's born there. She lives there. She dies there. She really goes nowhere. And I had to create a plot for that story out of whole cloth, which made me appreciate Orphan Train, where things move along at quite a clip. You get on a train and you get off a train and you have this incredible journey that you're already taking. So the plot of that story does half the work for you of writing a book. And so for me, Piece of the World was just so hard. I had to dredge a plot out of nothing. But then this story was even more terrifying because I'm writing about 100 years earlier than I've ever written, 1840s. I'm writing about Australia, a country I've never lived in, although I've now visited quite often and done a lot of research there. But it was a big, epic story. And I needed to make it, you know what this is like, Carolyn, when you're telling a story that has a lot of components, you need to make it intimate. Yeah. And that was the hard part for me, was pulling it down to the level of story with these characters. And that's so hard to do in my experience. It's like always remembering sort of that point my editor made, even though, oof. But always remembering that it comes down to an emotional connection with the reader.
Right, exactly. You know, the writer Mary Morris once told me when I was having just an anxiety attack over research. She said, well, you're doing it the wrong way. You don't want to start looking for facts and figures and dates. You're looking for the stories, which is exactly what you said. You're looking for, you know, it's not like, you know, 40 orphan trains across the country. It's more like one girl on this orphan train who went 5 stops without being picked up. And what did that feel like? And as soon as you say that, you feel that emotion in there. So when you were writing it,
yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to add to that I think there are some competing requirements writing a story like this. One, you want to, it's not 1,000, as you said, orphan trains. You want to focus on that one orphan train. And the other contradictory thing is that you can't get mired in the research. You can't get mired in when I say to write the details, I spent so much of my time with this book cutting out details and trying to only keep the salient ones, the ones that absolutely had to do with my characters, getting rid of every piece of my hard-won research. I mean, you know, we're good girls, aren't we, Carolyn? I want to show my work and prove that I did all this, you know.
Yeah, you can't.
You have to let go of all of it. You have to be willing to say, it will seep into the story. So for me, everything that my central characters didn't see, hear, feel, taste, touch, had to go. And that meant a whole wonderful story about the bush rangers out in the, you know, wilderness, who were these sort of terrifying cowboys that I was really kind of obsessed with for about a month of research. All of that had to go except for the slightest mention, because it just didn't have to do with the main part of my story.
When you were doing your research, did anything surprise you so much that it turned the plot a different way?
Oh my gosh, so many things. My husband says I shriek when I'm doing my research. I'm like, what? There are so many things in this story that were shocking to me. Like, for example, and you know, I'm not a historian. I only play one in my novels.
You do it very well.
But I did not know, you probably know this, smart people know this, I did not realize that Britain had sent 50,000 convicts to America.
I didn't know that.
And that's what they were planning to do, was just dump their convicts here. They got in the habit of doing that. And then we won the war, small thing, we won the war. And a few years later, the colonies just said, no more. There are no more convicts coming. And Britain had to figure out what to do next. So they first tried Africa, actually, and they wanted to establish a penal colony in Africa, because that's what they do, is they colonize other places, and in this kind of insidious way, they work their way in. But Africa, the port cities that they were looking at were too insecurable, or that's not a word, but they couldn't secure them well enough. And so they moved on, they abandoned that idea. They look over far away, and the Dutch and the French are sort of hanging out in Australia. But the Brits come in, as they always did, and they just wiped everyone else. They were like, we're putting our flag down, and now we own this continent.
Oh, colonialism.
They were very, very good at it for, as you know, many, many years. And so they came in and they did that. But here's what happened. They established Australia as a penal colony. First of all, we'll talk about it later, but they pushed all the Aboriginal people off their land and essentially into open air concentration camps. Whole other story that we'll get to. But anyway, by 1803, Australia was 9-1 men to women, because they were a little dim. They didn't realize that if they wanted to populate this country, they would need women. So they had sent all these men to penal colonies, and then these guys got out of prison and had no one to whatever. So this was the thing that really shocked me. And here was my big sort of yelp. The British government devised a secret program to sweep women off the streets under the flimsiest of pretenses for what we now call crimes of poverty.
Oh my God.
they stole a loaf of bread. Women and children and the poor had no rights whatsoever, zero, no rights. There was no foster care, there was no welfare, there were no social programs of any kind, no safety net. So these women were disappeared essentially. And over time, more than 50,000 women were sent across the ocean, as I said, swept off the streets. And the whole reason was that there was this master plan that they would breed children, and that Australia would not just be a penal colony, but would be actually would become a respectable colony someday. That's exactly what happened. 20% of Australians are descended from convicts. Okay, so that's the story that just astounded me.
This is so, you had a huge canvas to work on. So when you were writing this story, how did you find your narrative line, your main narrative line with all these things going on everywhere?
You kind of want to take all this research. I did research before I started writing for about a year, maybe a little more than a year. And then you start thinking, how do I create an entry point for the reader? And
for interesting. I think I read you talking about that. Keep going. I want to hear more.
Yeah,
so what's the entry way?
You've got this big story, and some of my novels start with character. But when you have a big story like this, you start with the big story, and then you have to figure out what you bring to it, how you make it breathe. And the first thing I did was I took a lot of pressure off by, I read this great quote from Hilary Mantel when she was writing, all of her incredible books, Bring Up the Bodies. She said, "I write contemporary novels that are set in the past."
Oh, that's interesting.
And I love that idea.
Really smart.
And so I made a lot of decisions from the beginning about not using dialect, for example. I used ye sometimes. That's really the only word I did. I used sentence construction to try to show a Scottish accent, an English accent, and then eventually bits of an Australian accent. But that was freeing. I tried not to use anachronistic language, but especially in dialogue, of course. But I did not worry too much about writing like a contemporary writer. It's a novel for readers today. It's not a novel for readers in the 1840s. So my task was, as I said, to find a way in. And what I thought is I've always, Caroline, I know you too feel this way, love 19th century novels. I loved Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina, and of course, Jane Eyre and Jane Austen novels. And I thought of the governess, a figure in a lot of books, a lot of 19th century novels. And what that figure does in those novels is provide a sort of counterpoint, not a counterpoint, but a parallel existence for the reader, because we readers are literate. The governesses are well read and literate, right? And so I created the character of Evangeline, who is the daughter of a vicar, grew up reading Shakespeare and poetry and everything she could get her hands on, was rewarded for that by her father and his love, but they were penniless. He died, she was orphaned, her mother had died in childbirth, and she became a governess. But of course, there was a handsome young cad. She was utterly unprepared and naive, and she sort of fell into this relationship, and it ended up ruining her life. And so she goes onto the convict ship. She gets arrested. Essentially, she's falsely accused of a crime and compounds it in various ways. And she ends up going to Newgate Prison and then to the ship. She was our guide, and I felt sort of a stand-in for the reader. And there's this moment when she's shackled. She's been taken out of this very comfortable upper middle class house in St. John's Wood, London. She's in this terrible prison carriage, sitting next to a constable. It's cold, it's dark, and she moves closer to him for warmth. And he flinches. And it's the first time. She's a beautiful, young 21-year-old woman. And it's the first time a man has ever flinched from her. And the line I wrote was, for the first time, she was beginning to to learn what it was like to be contemptible.
I remember that. I actually remember that line.
Yeah.
Thinking that's a good line.
When I wrote that line, I thought this is exactly Evangeline's journey. She's beginning to learn. She had never known. And so then I envisioned the novel as sort of a relay that one woman passes the baton to the next. She passes it to essentially to a character named Hazel, who's streetwise and 16 years old, has been betrayed by her own mother and ended up in this terrible place. But she has a superpower. She can heal people. She was raised by a midwife and she knows how to use herbs. And so she has a skill that other people want to barter with. And she, for that reason, has power. And so I loved moving from this sort of character who was fairly powerless, although pulls the reader in, to someone who has a way to make her way forward, and also who is not depressed. She's actually active. And Caroline, you and I both know this too, that having an active character does half the work for you as the writer. If your character has agency, you have a much easier time of propelling her or him through the novel.
Right.
And
if you're passive, it never works. It never works.
So one of my novels that didn't do so well, although I really like it, it's called Bird in Hand. I really like this novel. This is the one my editor was talking about, but I really loved that novel. But it is about a woman to whom something terrible happens right at the beginning. She's in a car accident in the first few pages. And I remember at a certain point as I was writing that book thinking, oh my gosh, she's in this deep hole of depression. And I have to get her out of it. And it's the hardest thing. So I try to avoid that if I can.
That's excellent advice. Can we talk about the whole idea of exile? Because it's just, it's literal and figurative in this novel. And besides of the mournfulness and the sorrow of exile there, you also put in this incredible strength of these women. And before you speak, I just want to say, anybody out there who has questions, please put them in the chat and you can ask Christina. Okay, so talk about exile.
Okay, so first of all, that was not my title for a long time. It wasn't until the book was done that I made a huge list. At first, I was calling the book Tin Ticket because these women wear tin tickets stamped with a number around their necks. And by the way, when I was in Charleston, I was visiting friends and they had excavated a whole a house. They're architects. And it framed on the mantelpiece of this house was a tin ticket, exactly like the tickets that the women wear in my novel. And I asked them what it was. And it turns out that in Charleston, the slaves who lived in town, when they left the house, they wore a tin ticket with the number of the house on it so that they could be identified, which was so chilling to me.
That's unbelievable.
And not all that different in some ways than the tin tickets my characters wore and bridled against that identified them. In my book, they were given, the women received them from a Quaker reformer, Elizabeth Fry, who said, if you don't wear these tickets, you're anonymous and your life is expendable and doesn't mean much. But if you wear the tickets, then people will always know who you are. It was a complicated thing. But anyway, so this tin ticket idea was very big in my mind. But when I finished the book, I realized the book was about a lot more than that. And it's really about exile, the idea of exile, both for my convict characters and for the Aboriginal girl who is a real person who existed, named Mathina, who's a character in this novel. And she was exiled from her people and from her land. And these women were as well. And sometimes, have you ever done a word search in your novel? I mean, we always do it to get rid of words. In fact, didn't you recently write about how many times you'd used a certain word?
15
I love that. Yeah, exactly. I know, we all do that. We all go through and say, how many times did I use always or never? Those are big ones for me. I never, I always, But I put in exiles, and I was amazed at how I used the book in different ways throughout. And that was sort of sealed it for me, that it really was about exile, the state of exile.
Yeah, it's incredible. I also want to talk about, you did this amazing thing at the end of the book, which I loved so much, where you flash forward 20 years. So we got to see like what was ahead. And when I saw that, I thought, oh, that's a really, really good idea. Where did that idea come from? And why did you know it was the exact right thing to do? Because it was.
I love the ending of this book. I get criticized for my books ending on sort of pensive moments when you don't quite know what's going to happen. I mean, I feel like in my past books, I thread in enough that, like, people complain about the end of Orphan Train, also because in the ebook, my author's note comes right afterwards. So people think they're going to be reading more of the story, and then they're like, what? It ends here. But in Orphan Train, I have this moment where everyone comes together in one scene, and I've sort of threaded in, Molly will probably go to college. I think I did the work of threading it in, but a lot of people are unsatisfied by that. And it's more ambiguous. And in this novel, I got to the end, and I had a typical kind of ending for Hazel. And she's on a mountaintop and she's thinking about her future. And I thought, okay, the end in large script. And then I realized that's crazy. I have the opportunity to bring this story full circle and to go ahead 26 years and have the daughter go back to England, and she ends up in exactly the place that the story starts. And you get a lot of satisfying answers to some questions that were raised at the beginning that you might never have known you would revisit. So it was joyful. Also for me to write, because it was so much fun. I was like, wow, I'm answering all these questions. And then I also, there was such kismet with that, because as I began researching this period, 26 years from when the main story ends, I discovered that there was this physician in London, this woman who had totally pulled the wool over the eyes of the government, and women were not allowed to become doctors, but she faked her way through without anyone knowing she was a woman. She became a doctor, and she founded this hospital that brought women all over the world to train them to be doctors, a hospital for women in London. So it made perfect sense that my character would end up coming to her. And in 1899, a group of 7 or 8 Australian women in Melbourne opened the first women's hospital in Melbourne. And it was exactly the perfect timing for my character as well. So it felt like all this stuff was just meant to be at the end.
It's incredible. How do the people in Australia feel about this history? Are they apologetic? Do they feel horrified the way Americans do about our history with slavery and Native Americans? Or have they disassociated themselves from it and said, though, that was the British, it's not us?
Well, as you might imagine, it's like it is here, meaning there are plenty of people who are reckoning with both the Aboriginal story and with the convict story. But there are plenty of people who aren't, and who say, that's not my problem. This was 100 and whatever years ago. Can't we move on? Why are you obsessed with the past? There is a lot of that. And particularly with when George Floyd was killed and Black Lives Matter rippled across America, it also rippled across the globe, as you know. And there were huge demonstrations in Australia, and they were about Aboriginal rights, of course. Right. And that story is that fight is very active, and there's a lot going on in it. And I think it will be many years until it feels that they're at a place that is really good, as it is for us. It's very complicated, as we know. Look at when a statue is toppled and how much of an outcry there is.
Right.
So, but let me say one more thing about the convict thing, because it's a lot like the Orphan Train writers. The train writers were mostly quite ashamed of their experience in the moment, and for for many of them for the rest of their lives, because they had been made to feel so different and so lesser than, and they were immigrant children coming into often homogeneous communities. So it wasn't until their descendants came along, especially their grandchildren, that these stories began to be told. And there's a lot of pride around the orphan trains and around, the descendants are so proud. And that exact thing happened in Australia. It used to be called the convict stain, and people who were convicts who got out, and then their immediate descendants didn't want anyone to know. And it was kept very close to the vest. And now you go to Australia and people are thrilled to tell you that they're descended from convicts. There's a lot, it's like all of us with our crazy family history.
Yeah. And it's it also shows a kind of strength. Do we have any questions for Christina?
That we need to answer?
Okay, then I have another question for you, which is, we do. Did you go down a rabbit hole while researching?
I went down so many rabbit holes. Yes, and this is both the joy and the problem, of course, of research. I had to cut myself off at a certain point because the research was so interesting. And of course, it's a lot easier than the actual writing. So the writing requires you to synthesize all this stuff. Whereas with the research, you find that there are always new things that you need to know. At a certain point, I don't know how this is for you, Caroline, but in my experience, you just have to let go and trust your own process. Would you say that's true for you?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it's like with anything in writing, you finish a book, you have to let it go. Hopefully you go on to something else. Which I have another question for you, which is, so is your next book, are you writing now? Are you working on a new book? Is it historical? Is it modern? Can you say anything about it? I know sometimes you don't want people don't want.
Unfortunately, it's set in the past, and I'm just what I'm doing. I'm so annoyed at myself. I someday, as I said, someday I'll get back to writing contemporary novels. But this one is based on a family story, two sisters in Civil War era North Carolina, and they marry two Asian brothers, and they have 21 children between them, and that is the interesting aspect of the story. It is the craziest story, and it's very, very interesting. But also, I think I'm very foolish for writing about the Civil War, because so many people who know so much about the Civil War care a lot about it, and I have to be really careful.
Well, that's certainly something that you're terrifying yourself with. Where did you find that story? Is this a family story of yours?
It's my mother's great aunt.
Oh my God.
So it's a whole, and listen, that's not even the half of it. It is such a crazy story, but it is so fascinating. And I'm telling the story from the two sisters' perspectives. But wait, before we go back to me, Caroline, what do you think about your own, are you tempted to do anything like this that is set long ago? I know you do write books that are set in the past.
Yeah. I wrote two historical novels. I wrote one that was set in the 60s, around the 70s, and one that was in the 50s, because I really like those periods of time. I don't know. I'm happy if you have a story for me to write. I never know where the stories are coming from, but I loved it when I did it. It was so much fun to write about the 50s, because the 50s has been the Cold War. Yeah. It was so much fun to research the 60s. I talked to people who knew Manson, who knew Charles Manson, and that was just, I loved it. I love talking to people, but I try to research in every novel, as you do, because it's just really fun to talk to people. When you get these weird things that people tell you, and it's the same thing where you yelp and say, "Oh my God, are you kidding? This is really real," and then you sort of fit it in. So,
can you talk about what you're working on now?
No, I can't. I just know I can't. I'm actually working. I just finished the novel that I talked to you about and asked you about the plot a million years ago.
Yes.
And we had some lunch in Boston with a bunch of writers, and I was having so much trouble with my plot. And you just got up from where you were sitting and came and sat down beside me and said, "Speak. I will." And you did. And I was so, so grateful. But also, what I was most grateful is like, your face was excited, and I thought, oh, that's really good. It wasn't like the kind of face when you tell someone a story and they're, oh,
Right.
that's interesting.
Right.
Well, I
Right.
just finished it. I just sent it to my agent. So
That
just
is
trying to
very
see what's up.
exciting. Can you tell what the title is?
It's called Days of Wonder right now, but Algonquin never likes my title, so I'm sure it's going to be called something else. So do you have any more questions for the wonderful Christina? If not, I want to tell people to please, like, oh, Christina, what's your favorite bookstore where people can buy it? Favorite indie?
Oh, that's so great. I mean, Watchung Books in Watchung, New Jersey, Montclair, New Jersey, which is the town I lived in for 20 years, is just wonderful.
It's a wonderful bookstore. Buy Christina's book there. If you're not near, if you want to support your local indie, you can find your local indie at bookshop.org. This was just phenomenal. It's always like so much fun when I get to speak to someone whose work I love and who I love as a person. And thank you all for being here. And we will see you next time.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you all so much.
Bye. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.